In July of 1917, the painter Tom Thomson paddled out onto Canoe Lake and was found drowned. A coroner called it an accident. The ruling never sat right. This was Algonquin Park in Ontario, deep lake and forest country. Thomson knew this water better than almost anyone alive. He was at home on it. He went out on a calm summer afternoon. 8 days later, the lake gave him back. Case was closed in an evening, and for over a century, it has never quite been answered. One painter, one lake, a ruling that outlived its own evidence. This channel is called Quiet Hill. This is the case of Tom Thomson, the painter of Canoe Lake. He was last seen alive on the 8th of July, 1917. He was 39 years old. His empty canoe was seen floating that same afternoon. His body did not surface for 8 days. In warm water, that is a long time. There was a mark on his temple. There was a fishing line wound around one leg. The coroner arrived after the burial. He never examined the body himself. He held one evening inquest in the living room of a man some of the community suspected. Then he ruled it an accident. The record beneath that ruling has been contradicting it ever since. Chapter 1, The Painter Bars. Thomas John Thomson was born on the 5th of August, 1877 in Claremont, Ontario. He was the 6th of 10 children. The family moved to a farm near Leith, close to Owen Sound, on Georgian Bay. That was the landscape he grew up in. Woods, water, and the long gray light of the Canadian Shield. Tramped the bush as a boy. He hunted and he fished and he drew. He came to serious painting late. For years, he worked as a commercial artist and a photo engraver, first in Seattle, then in Toronto. It was not until 1912, when he was already in his mid-30s, that his first trips into Algonquin Park changed everything. The park turned a competent commercial hand into one of the most original landscape painters. Now here's the thing the popular telling almost always gets wrong. Tom Thomson was not a member of the Group of Seven. He could not have been. The Group of Seven was formally constituted in 1920. Thomson died in 1907. What is true is this: he was the close friend, the painting companion, and the artistic precursor of the man who would go on to found that group. His patron was Dr. James McCallum, a Toronto eye doctor, who supported him and championed his work. In one astonishing burst across the winter of 1916 into 1917, he painted the two canvases that made him permanent: the Jack Pine and the West Wind, both of them worked up from small oil sketches he had made the spring before. In a professional career of barely 5 years, he produced roughly 50 canvases and more than 400 small oil sketches. When the National Gallery of Canada bought the Jack Pine in 1918, the reputation was sealed. In the standard telling, he's called Canada's Van Gogh. The phrase carries both the genius and the early strange death. That is the man. He was 39 years old, and at the height of his work. Everything that follows is about how he died, and about why the account of how he died has never held together. Chapter 2: Canoe Lake and the community around it. Algonquin Park is a vast tract of lake and forest country in central Ontario. It was established in 1893. By 1917, it held a thin seasonal population, rangers and guides and loggers, and the small tourist trade that came out by rail. Canoe Lake was the center of that little world. At its north end stood Mowat Lodge, modest guest house run by Shannon Fraser, and his wife, Annie Thomson, boarded there. When he was not painting, he worked as a fishing and canoeing guide. The people who moved through the rest of this story were all fixtures of that community. Their names matter, so hold on to them. Mark Robinson was the park ranger, a former soldier, and a friend of Thomson's. He would become the single most important witness to the death, and in time the least stable. It is Robinson's diaries and his decades of retellings that generated most of the cases lasting suspicion, and it is Robinson whose account shifted and grew across the 35 years he kept talking about it. Martin Blesher Jr. was a neighbor, a German-American whose family summered on Canoe Lake. It was the middle of the First World War. Canada was at war with Germany and feeling ran high. Blesher was pro-German. Thomson was loudly pro-Canada. That friction was real. But keep this straight, none of that social context is evidence of anything. It is only why Blesher became a figure of suspicion. Winifred Traynor was a woman from Huntsville whose family had a cottage on the lake. She's described as Thomson's romantic interest, his rumored fiancée. How serious it was, and whether there was any engagement at all, is one of the most contested threads in the whole. And Dr. Goldwyn Howland was a Toronto neurologist on vacation. He happened to be the only physician on the lake when the body surfaced. Chapter 3: The 8th of July 1917, the last day. On the night of the 7th of July, by several accounts, Thomson was drinking with others at a party at Canoe. One persistent account, second-hand and disputed, holds that the evening ended in a quarrel, possibly a physical one. The other man in that account is either Shannon Fraser or Martin Blesher. The claimed subject changes with the teller. With Blesher, the quarrel is said to be about a war. With Fraser, it's said to be about money. It is documented that Fraser owed Thomson money. By Winifred Traynor's own later letter, Thomson had loaned Fraser about $250 to buy canoes. He had been repaid only in small pieces. Whether any of that produced a fight on the 7th of July, the record cannot establish. It rests on recollections given years and decades afterward, of that thought you would need it more than once. What is better documented is the next day, the morning of the 8th of July. Thomson was seen that morning with Shannon Fraser. Some accounts have them walking toward Joe Lake Dam. Others have Thomson helping Fraser move boy. In the early afternoon, he set out alone in his gray-green canoe, loaded with gear. Mark Robinson's diary records that Thomson left Fraser's dock after 12:30 to go to T Lake Dam or West Lake. That is the last confirmed sighting of Tom Thomson alive. At around 3 that same afternoon, his canoe was seen floating empty out on the lake. The person who saw it was Martin Blacker Jr. And here is the first of the case's structural oddities. Blacker, by his own account, retrieved the drifting canoe and put it away in storage. He raised no alarm. He treated an unmanned canoe belonging to an expert canoeist as unremarkable, until questions began the following week. There is even a dispute about the canoe. The common account has it floating overturned. At least one account has the Blashers finding it upright. Chapter 4, The 8 Days, and the 16th of July. For a full week there was no body. An empty, undamaged canoe, its owner gone, and no immediate organized search of the kind the situation called for. That delay is itself part of the strangeness. Over the following days, rangers and guides and watched the shoreline and dragged parts of the lake. Thomson was one of the most capable canoeists on Canoe Lake, a man entirely at home on the water, which is precisely why his disappearance from a calm summer lake struck the people who knew him as wrong from the start. Days passed, the lake gave up nothing. The delay deserves to be stated precisely. In warm midsummer water, the gases of decomposition, you should bring a drowned body up. Thomson's body did not appear for 8 or to those inclined to suspicion, and Mark Robinson foremost among them. The long submersion suggested the body had been weighted, held down, and surfaced only when the weight failed. To those inclined to the official view, 8 days in a specific body of water is unusual, but variation, both readings live in the same fact. That is the shape of nearly everything in this case. On the morning of Monday, the 16th of July, Dr. Godwin Howland saw a shape rise in the water of Little Wapomeo Island. It was Thomson's body. It was stowed in and secured, and because Howland was the only doctor present, his observations became the medical foundation of everything after. They were later set down in a sworn affidavit. Its wording matters. Howland described the man of about 40 in an advanced state after 8 days in the water, and then the two details that would fuel a century of argument. He recorded a bruise on the right temple, about 4 inches long, and some bleeding from the right ear. He recorded no other external marks. His conclusion. Two things about that affidavit collide with the rest of the record. First, the side of the head. Howland, the physician writing at the time, placed a mark on the right temple. Mark Robinson, the ranger, insisted in his journal that it was the left. This is not trivial. It is a direct conflict between the two men who actually checked the body on a fact that ought to have a single answer. It has never been resolved. Second, the lungs. The drowning ruling rests on the body having drowned, and one of the most repeated claims is that there was no water in the lungs. If that were true, it would mean Thomson was dead before he entered the water, so here provenance is everything. Howland's affidavit does not record an absence of water in the lungs. The no water claim traces to Mark Robinson's later recollections. And then there was the fishing line wound around one of Thomson's legs at the ankle. In most tellings was fishing line. In the popular version, wrapped 16 or 17 times carefully around the limb. It is the single most cited piece of physical evidence in the whole murder case, and its provenance is the most fragile in the whole file. The 16 or 17 figure comes from Mark Robinson, and it comes late. He did not mention the fishing line at all in the immediate record. He first raised it around 1930, 13 years later, to the writer Baldwin Davis. Only in the early 1950s, some 35 years on, did he add the specific detail, wound carefully 16 or 17 times around the ankle. The skeptical reading is plainer. The line was simply what the men who found the floating body used to tow it in and tether it to a tree. Or in a gentler version, a line bound around a sore ankle, a folk remedy of the period. The number 16 is doing enormous work. And it rests on the memory of one man added in stages decades late. Chapter 5, The Inquest and the Ruling. The coroner was Dr. Arthur Ranney of North Bay. He did not arrive quickly. Word had to travel. Ranney reached Canoe Lake by train on the night after the body was found. By then, events had outrun him. Under the summer heat and the state of the body, the decision had already been taken to bury Thomson at Canoe. The burial went ahead on the 17th of July, before the coroner had convened an inquest, and by the plain sequence of events without Ranney ever examining the body himself. The inquest he then held was a single evening proceeding, and it was held in a place that has troubled observers ever since. The home of Martin Blasher. Of all the buildings on Canoe Lake, the inquiry into a death, the community already whispered, suspicious, was convened in the living room of a man some of them suspected. Ranney took testimony from the assembled witnesses, Mark Robinson among them, and Howland's account, and he concluded that death was an accidental drowning. He wrote that the evidence pointed to drowning, and he attributed the mark on the temple to the body striking some obstacle, stone, or the whole thing was past a coroner who never saw the body, arriving after the burial, holding a single evening hearing in the home of a suspicious figure, reaching a drowning verdict on a body that was already in the ground. Whatever one concludes about how Thomson actually died, the procedure by which the death was officially closed was, by any modern standard, gravely deficient. And that procedure produced the ruling that stands unamended to this day. Chapter 6, 2. Burials and a grave no one can agree on. Thomson was buried on the 17th of July in the Little Moat Cemetery on a sandy rise above Canoe Lake in an oak casket built and embalmed on site. that should have been the end of it. It was not, because Thomson's family wanted him home. Under the direction of his older brother George, arrangements were made to exhume the body and rebury it in the family plot at Leith near Owen Sound. This is where the case acquires the feature that has kept it permanently unresolved, not merely debated. Actually, the exhumation was carried out by F.W. Churchill, an undertaker from Huntsville. He arrived on the evening after the burial with a sealed metal casket. Sealing was legally required to move a body by rail. A telegram to Shannon Fraser recorded it plainly. Undertaker Churchill will arrive this evening with steel casket to exhume Tom. What Churchill then did is the crux story. He got to the cemetery around 10 at night. He dismissed everyone who had come with him, and by the account that has come down, he worked entirely alone. He dug through 6 feet of soil, opened the grave, moved the remains into the metal casket, sealed it, and filled the grave back in, all in roughly 3 hours. The sealed casket went by train to Owen Sound, where the undertaker R.H. Flabel received it. I was reburied at Leith on the 21st of July. It was never opened. No one at Leith ever saw the body, and from that grew the doubt that no amount of argument has put down. People present, including those who helped load it, reportedly said the casket was too light to contain a body. Mark Robinson flatly did not believe one man could have exhumed the body alone in that time. His conclusion held to his death was that Thomson's body never left Canoe Lake. Whether that is true, or the embroidery of an unreliable witness, is not resolvable from the paper record. But the sealed grave means it has never been confirmed to hold Thomson at all. In the autumn of 1956, 39 years later, 4 men went to the Okmulgee Cemetery to settle the question. The group was led by William Little, later a provincial judge. Mark Robinson had told them roughly where the grave lay. There was no marker, and they found human remains, a skeleton in the remnants of a wooden casket with a hole in the left temple region of the skull. Chu Little and his friends, this was Tom Thomson, still at Canoe Lake, exactly as Robinson had always said. The remains were reported, seized, and sent to Toronto for examination under Dr. Noble Sharp. And here the case forks in 2 directions that have never rejoined. The official finding from Sharp was that the remains were not Thomson's. He concluded they were an Indigenous male in his late 20s, about 5 feet 8. Thomson was roughly 6 feet tall and 39. As for the hole, Sharp determined it was not a surgical opening, surgical opening in the bone. That finding has never been comfortable, and it did not settle anything. Local park officials disputed that any Indigenous people. And decades later, the journalist Roy McGregor reopened the forensic question. He had photographs of the 1956 skull examined against photographs of Thomson. Those specialists concluded there was nothing to rule out the skull being Thomson's, and arguably much to support it. a skull consistent with a middle-aged man of Northern European background. McGregor's position, argued at length in 2010, is that the 1956 remains were Thomson's, that Thomson never left Canoe Lake. The two verdicts cannot both be right, and the material to decide between them is gone or out of reach. The 1956 remains were reburied or lost, and the Thomson family has never permitted the Leith grave to be opened. Absent DNA from either the Canoe Lake remains or the sealed casket, the question of where Tom Thomson's body lies is more than a century later, genuinely and formally open. This is not a rhetorical flourish, it is the literal state of the evidence. Chapter 7, theories the historians cannot reconcile. 3 broad explanations have contended for 100 years. Each is presented here as a documented claim attached to its source, not as a first accident, the official view, the coroner's ruling, Thomson drowned. The modern scholarly defense is best represented by Gregory Klages, who works the late second-hand accounts back against the primary evidence and finds the death consistent. The art historian David Silcox offered the plainest mechanical version. A man stands in a canoe to cast a line. That single account explains the temple mark and the drowning together, without any second party at all. Second, suicide, that Thomson, under financial and personal strain, took his own life. This is handled plainly and without sensation. Its most cited source is a 1972 statement by an elderly contemporary who said Shannon Fraser had confided that Thomson was under pressure to marry and drowned himself rather than go through with it. The theory is contested, and it rests on a very late second-hand recollection. The related suggestion that Winifred Traynor was pregnant is rumor and undocumented. Third, foul play, 2 named variants. The first centers on Shannon Fraser, that Thomson, demanding repayment of the loan, fought with Fraser, that Fraser struck him, that he fell and hit his head, and that the body was put in the lake after dark. The key source is Daphne Crombie, a friend of Annie Fraser, who said Annie had told her a version of actually this. It is the reconstruction Roy McGregor came to favor. The second variant centers on Martin Blesher Jr., wartime animosity, a reported threat that Thomson would not live to see another summer. This is the theory William Little built toward. Every one of these variants rests on late or second-hand testimony and is established fact. And they are mutually inconsistent. The case cannot be both a Fraser cover-up and a Blesher. Chapter 8, a century of reinvestigation. The remarkable thing about this case is that the institution stopped in 1917 and the amateurs never did. The reinvestigation is almost entirely a public, unofficial, century-long effort. It began with Lodwin Davies, a writer who, by the early 1930s, set out to write an appreciation of Thomson. Instead, she found herself channeling the suspicions Mark Robinson had been nursing for years, her 1935 volume put the murder question into public print for the first time in the form of a pointed question: who had struck him a blow across the temple? Davies never met Thomson. She was in effect the amplifier for Robinson's doubts. Then came Judge William Little, whose 1956 take and his 1970 bestseller moved the case from regional folklore to a national obsession. His book and a CBC documentary that followed argued for murder and for the claim that Thomson still lay at Canoe. The exact claim the official 1956 finding had rejected. Little leaned heavily on Robinson's diaries, and critics note that Robinson was a storyteller. The most significant modern work is Roy McGregor's, published in 2010. McGregor grew up in Huntsville, where Winifred Traynor was a figure of his childhood. He spent decades on the case. The book is a biography, forensic reanalysis, and at its heart, an argument that Thomson died in a fight, most probably with Shannon Fraser, and that his body was disposed of. Alongside it stands Gregory Klages' skeptical corrective, and a feature documentary that surveyed the life and the mystery for a wide audience. Public attention rested again at the centenary. In 2017, Algonquin Park exhibitions a commemorative swim the length of Canoe Lake on the 8th of July. And a genuinely strange coincidence, the great limb of the old white birch that had stood over Thomson's original grave for 100 years broke off and crashed to the ground that same centennial summer. That same centennial summer. Threaded through all of it is the grave marker question. A memorial cairn was raised at Hayhurst Point. And in the 21st century, the Pequot-Kanagan First Nation told the remains had been officially declared Indigenous, petitioned the province to exhume and the government declined. The remains stayed where they were buried or lost. Coda, the difference between a question answered and a question closed. Here is what has not happened in 108 years. The inquest of the 17th of July, 1917, has never been reopened. No official body has ever revised the finding of accidental drowning. No exhumation of the Leith grave has ever been authorized. No DNA test has ever been run. The case is institutionally exactly as close as Dr. Ranney left it on a summer evening. Consider the record that closure sits on top of that 4-inch mark. The two men who handled the body could not agree the side of claim of no water in the lungs unresolved because fishing line, whose 16 times rests on one man's memory, offered decades late a sealed casket at Leith that no one ever opened, and a recovered skull declared by one official verdict to be an Indigenous man, and by a later reanalysis to be Thomson himself. The institutional question is not whether Ranney was right. It is why an official finding, once entered, exerts so much inertia that a century of contradiction cannot move. The finding stands not because the evidence supports it beyond doubt, but because closing a case is an act the system performs once, and reopening one is an act it almost never performs at all. Tom Thomson painted the Jack Pine and the West Wind, and then at 39 he went out onto a calm lake he knew better than almost anyone alive and did not come back. The mystery his death outlives is not who. It is the question of how society decides that a question is finished. When what it costs to leave a contradiction that large sealed inside our this channel is called Quiet Hill. We come back to the things people did and the silences that grew around them. Subscribe, and the next one will find you. Until then, keep him in mind. One painter, one calm lake, and a ruling that has outlived its own evidence for over 100 years.